All right. Well, I say we get this thing going. All right, everyone. My name is Devin Smith. I am a consultant here at Tevora, working as part of the threat and incident response team. In this webinar, I will be finishing off the talk on the different methods for incident response. So last time, what did we cover? In the last webinar, I went over what you should be doing to prepare for an incident, how you can actively look for an incident within your environment, and then once you have identified an incident, what can you do to contain it? If you missed out on the previous webinar, I highly recommend that you go back and watch those slides so you can get the full entire picture of how to handle an incident within your organization and kind of prepare ahead of time for those situations. So in this one, what will we be covering? In this webinar, I will be covering what it means to eradicate the threat from your environment, how to recover your production environment and validate that everything is ready to go back up and continue operations, and then how do we learn from these events and adjust our weak points so that we do not respond to the same incident in the future. In the eradication phase, we need to use the information that we gained during the identification and containment phases to make sure that the best and most educated decisions on what to do to clean up these systems so that they can eventually make it into the production environment again is really what the overall goal is for this eradication phase, is to assess each system and figure out what it is that we can do responsibly to clean up these systems. So best case scenario is that we can roll back to an uninfected backup of the system and continue forward into the response steps. Worst case scenario is we have to do a full reinstall of the system from a factory image. Then somewhere kind of in between those two solutions is going through the systems and manually removing the threat. But keep in mind, though, that this is the probably most time-consuming and risky of these solutions. So after we have removed the threat from the systems, we need to improve the defenses and validate that the same attack will not be able to happen again in the future. This can be a lengthy process, and you will really want to dive into making sure that you're validating that all systems within the environment are patched for those known attacks. And then we kind of need to approach this in the idea that if one system is vulnerable, then they all are. So in the cleanup phase of eradication, we're going to clean up the systems that have been infected within the environment. But before we dive really into that part of the response, I want to touch upon the backup policy like I did last week during the documentation, so we can kind of really understand why the backup policy affects the part of cleaning up of the systems. Because hypothetically, if your policy purely only covers 2 weeks of a rotation or some kind of very small amount of a backup retention, then you run the risk of, if your attacker has been in there for 3 or more weeks, or just any amount of time that's longer than what your backup retention policy is, then all of those backups should be considered to be infected. So you can no longer actually take that route. So now you have to look into doing the whole re-imaging or manually hunting for the threat throughout your environments, and those can be really time-consuming tasks. So this is why you really need to have a solid understanding of your backup policy and how it's going to affect this part of the incident response measures. So based off the logs and other evidence gathered so far, we should know if a backup is even a viable option at this point, or if it is for some systems versus others. But realistically, like I said, if we can kind of assume that one image or one backup of a system is tainted, then we kind of have to assume that all of them are for the most part, unless there's a surefire way to validate and say that one is clean over the other. If we know that the backups are infected and we can't use them, then we need to move into the manual removal or full reinstall from factory image. While manual removal might sound like the next best solution because you're not having to wipe the whole entire computer and do a full entire reinstall from factory image, it's really the most risky in the end result because you risk the fact of having an artifact that might still be lying on the system and allow for the attacker to have some kind of foothold to be able to get back into your systems, or any other attacker if they can actually find that artifact within your network. So realistically, the manual removal process should only be like your last kept option. And then at that, if you even suspect that a rootkit has been part of the compromise, then a full reinstall from factory image should be done without question. So on to our defense and validation. So now that we have what we believe to be a non-infected set of systems that can be placed back into production, we need to start looking over our defenses and how we can validate these systems thoroughly. One of the nice things that we can actually get from this attack is we know what the attacker did for the most part. Everything that we gathered evidence-wise, we can use that to kind of hone and harden our systems alongside of regular practices for hardening a system to really solidify us against that future attack in the same exact methods. So different methods and solutions that we can use is we could create custom signatures for the malware used. We can apply firewall and router filters, move the system to new IP addresses, do null routing, change DNS names, and then just general applying of patching and hardening of systems. And then anything else that is situationally that you look at and you deem that could help make your defenses a stronger structure is, but still focus on the idea that the company has to remain functional. So yeah, that's kind of just your mindset throughout this whole entire idea of building up your defenses so this does not happen again. Once we have completed setting up our defenses, we need to start running different things like vulnerability scanners to validate that the attack is no longer existent. And at this also time, we should be looking at what other vulnerabilities that are known are we also vulnerable to. Because this is the time to really be able to kind of like, it's like the holy grail time where you can kind of be able to really dive into these systems and be able to clean them up and patch them to where known vulnerability-wise, they are fixed for those. So at this point, it's kind of a cat and mouse game of whatever the attacker thinks of next that is not known. So we need to kind of dive in, do the vulnerability scanning, figure out what systems need to be patched, how they need to be patched, and we need to do this not only for the infected systems, but also the systems that have the same configuration, or even neighboring systems. Really, if you can do this for the whole entire environment, it's better. So the more systems outside of just the infected ones that you can cover with this validation, the better. So recovery. In recovery, we want to make sure that systems are placed back into the production environment at the best time, so if troubleshooting needs to occur, it won't directly affect the production environment. Some companies, this is doable where they have a nightly downtime or weekend downtime. Some companies, not so much of a doable thing because they are a continuous operation. They're continuously moving, doing something. So it's really up to the company's discretion to figure out when is the best time. But you need to take that approach with the idea that if this system starts acting improperly, we need to be able to do the troubleshooting in place and be able to actually get that system back up and running. And while we're talking about validating in the previous slide for vulnerabilities, in this slide we're talking more about the validation that the systems and network admins need to go through on their processes and checks to make sure that the environment is stable. It's not really up to the incident response team at this point to do the validation because the incident response team isn't really going to know what's the normal for that environment, what's the status quo for that environment. Whereas your systems admins, your network admins are really going to be able to look at these systems and be able to say whether or not they're acting in a normal way, if they're interacting well, or if something's off and needs to be adjusted. So it's really at this point in time that the systems admins and network admins need to really jump in and start to validate that system. So we know that it's good to resume normal operations. So within the first 24 hours, and it's a very tall order to suggest that during the first 24 hours, after days spent and hours and everything else spent in this incident, but you really need to dive into writing up the documentation and making sure that you're getting a complete initial report made up while everyone's minds are still fresh of what exactly they did, how they did it, who else might have interacted with it, and just being able to kind of get that full memory sweep from everyone before stepping out of the office and getting that full breath of fresh air after this incident. Because each person should be going back through their notes of any information that they gathered during the incident and make sure that they have a full, complete knowledge and coverage of everything that they did so it can kind of be incorporated into that final documentation and evidence for the incident. While this is happening, the incident response team will equally compile their notes and begin the initial report. Once the initial report's been completed, it's going to be sent out to all the parties that were involved in the incident. That way so they can start to review it and then make any adjustments that they deem necessary. So say you have a party that saw section X as a different scenario. So what they would do is they would provide an amendment to this initial report with their reasonings and different evidence to support why that's their view on that. So that you can then kind of make, well, not really make the adjustment, but add that to the initial report. Because you don't want to change the overall report to make it fit to everyone's different outlook and view on what it was, because then eventually you're going to have parts that are not fully making a full picture for what was the incident. So that's why you just have amendments for each and every single one of the sections that people might have had a difference with. And the evidence that they supply for it. That way, so whenever this might actually, well, if this might ever actually reach into going into a court situation, each person can speak to their knowledge and their memories of the events, because that's really what this report is for. It's for being able to speak to every single person's memory and knowledge of what exactly happened during the incident. So within the next 2 weeks, we need to really start finalizing that incident response report. We need to finalize the executive summary so that we have all the fine details and can begin to close out the case and be able to kind of return to normal operations. We don't want to rush this whole entire process at the same time, because while it's good to get the report done sooner while everyone's memories are fresh, you don't want to just slap it together and have this hodgepodge of a report. It needs to be very consistent, detailed, and have good evidence that will support what needs to be supported if it does go to court. Because remember, every incident might not actually have the idea of this might end up in court, but that is the realistic nature, is each one of these may eventually end up in front of a judge and jury, and it needs to be the most direct and concise amount of facts that you can have on file. So then, close to the end of the 2 weeks time frame, it doesn't have to be the full 2 weeks, but anywhere within that 2 weeks, it's really a good suggested time for holding a meeting. It really shouldn't be a technical meeting where you dive into the bits and bytes of the attack. It's purely a executive level meeting where you dive into the who, what, where, when, why, and hows of how this whole entire attack occurred. You're not wanting to start breaking out binary during this time. This is just a nice executive meeting. If you really need to feel like you need to, as an organization, to have that technical meeting, definitely do this at a different time. This one should really only be about a half a day in length. It's really good to also note that this is the time to where you're just stating the reason and the solution for the incident. It can kind of become a game of wanting to kind of point the finger and say who is to be the blame, or who and why. But realistically, at this point in time, as the incident response team and everything, you want to focus on what can we do in the future and how can we not have this happen again. Let HR handle that other situation as far as that is, if it's a HR situation at all. This is the time for incident response to be able to do what they do best, be able to actually talk to the defense measures. All right, I mean, and that's about it. It's a very clean thing as far as with the lessons learned. Does anyone have any questions at this time for me? Okay, that's a good question. As far as for during the incident and taking of notes, is it, because I mentioned that this might actually end up in court, is it best to do this in ink or pen, or pencil, sorry. Overall, everything that you do that's handwritten needs to be done in ink. This is because if it's going into court, they want to know that there's not anything being omitted from the actual documentation that was gathered during that time. If you're typing it out and you're kind of getting all that information out, then that's one thing, but realistically, if you have the option to, write down your notes and write it down in ink. That way, so it holds that much more bearing in a courtroom than if it was not. Another good question as far as that is for the backup policy. How long is a good amount of time to have for a backup policy when it comes to incident response? Well, sorry. Realistically, that boils down to each and every company's risk, what they are willing to accept for risk versus the amount of storage that they want to have built up. I mean, there's really no good standard practice as far as that goes for how long to keep these backups, but it's just really up to what the company deems necessary. How far back do they want to keep? How far back can they keep to where it still makes sense for an incident response measure? So it just kind of boils down to that, and the end result is you have to figure it out through a company for what you want to actually keep on file. All right. Any other questions at this time, or? All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming out. I greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you guys in the future webinars. Have a great day.